Okay. Merry Christmas, Christmas Day. Hope everyone got the presents that they wanted. Welcome to This and That. We're going to talk today, because it's Xmas, on gifts and commodities. It's not really that much of a divergence from what we've been looking at. It is important to remember that David Graeber, I think, is an important person in the larger picture of trying to figure out the laws of value and a Marxian approach to it. Although Graeber, I think, self-identified as an anarchist, uh, and he was probably, with all due respect, one of the more brilliant minds in anthropology, until his all too premature passing during COVID. On the moral grounds of economic really, I'm going to do a thing by Graeber about Mos, and another thing about Mos and gifts that is from a socialist website. So it's not dissimilar from our particularly Marxist path. And also because, as I said, this has something to do with value, exchange, and et cetera. The idea of gift is actually a very important one, considering the kinds of markets that existed for things that you may conceive of as a kind of gift. For example, blood banks are a kind of gift giving. There are other forms of a gift activity that are not widely discussed, and in fact, you could see that this idea of remuneration for exchanges is more problematic relative to capitalism. I mean, other than sort of Christmas bank accounts and those kind of silly things. For all the vast literature on the gift, the concept is surprisingly under-theorized. This is because everyone assumes that there is something called the gift, that all transactions not involving payment or the promise of payment are the same thing, whether seen as a matter of generosity, lack of calculation, creating social relations, or a refusal to distinguish between generosity and self-interest. The possibility that gifts operate according to different transactional logics is often overlooked. In challenging the assumption of the gift's conceptual unity, I follow, that is David Graeber, I follow Marcel Mauss, whose great contribution to social theory was to recognize not only the diversity of economic transactions across human society, but also that all important economic and moral possibilities are present in any human society. Even if we like to contrast gift economies with market economies as if each represents a total conceptual universe, Mauss did not see things this way. True, he did write, for instance, at the end of his essay on the gift, quote, "The word interest can be traced back to the Latin interest written on account books, opposite rents to be recovered. The victory of rationalism and mercantilism was required before the notions of profit and the individual were given currency and raised to the level of principles. It is only our Western societies that quite recently turned man into an economic animal." Now, when making such statements, Mauss was referring to how in a given social order, people seize on certain practices and use them to generalize about human nature. Our conception of man as an economic animal is made possible by certain specific technologies: money, ledger sheets, mathematical calculations of interest, which we then generalize to reveal the hidden truth behind everything. But the existence of such technologies proves nothing. Neither is Mauss really saying that such calculation is anything new. And we know this, of course, from Hudson as well. In fact, Mauss often goes much further. In his lectures on ethnography, he insisted that money, in the broadest sense of the term, existed in virtually all known human societies. and that markets appeared in most, with some exceptions, such as the Celtic world. He said that the same was also true of communism. In his essay on the gift, there is a profound tension. On the one hand, he allows that even institutions like the calculation of interest payments do not go back just to the Romans or even Mesopotamians, but it can exist in archaic societies like the Quaquedal, that's probably I pronounced it wrong, societies which did not even practice agriculture. Yet at other times, he makes an evolutionary argument that societies have moved from total pre-stations to the aristocratic potlatch to modern commercial markets. In the essay, when he speaks of stages, except for the most primitive peoples, he's talking about dominant institutions. We might think of ourselves abstractly as calculating machines, but most of us only act that way in specific situations. Ordinarily, pure irrational expenditure is the rule among both the rich and the poor, and it would be hard to argue that means and utilitarianism is really the rule, even for the middle classes. This notion was taken up by George Bataille, and we are used to reading most retrospectively through his work. Bataille's elaboration of the idea of expenditure was largely a notion of freedom as consumption and consumption as ritualized destruction, which is more about unveiling the hidden logic of capitalism with its rationalized, productive, and expressive consumptive spheres rather than a great truth about humanity. Most was making a more subtle argument, not unlike Antonio Gramsci's around the same time. True, the bourgeoisie projects certain aspects of its own reality as a theory of human nature and society. Life is a marketplace. We're all isolated individuals entering contractual relations. But this view is never stable, since it is constantly contradicted by our own daily experience, even by bourgeois experience. Socialist ideas once made intuitive sense because we have all had the experience of communism. The Manual of Ethnography makes clear that most felt that this was always the case in any relatively large and complex system of human relations, as he puts it, almost everywhere. All major social possibilities are already present simultaneously, at least in embryonic form. There will always be individualism in communism too, something like money and the calculation it makes possible, but also every sort of gift. The question then is, which dominant institutions shape our basic perceptions of humanity? Thus, aristocratic societies like the Quaquedal or the ancient Celts are dominated by the heroic gift with endless games of munificence, liberality, and one-upsmanship. Such games were limited to the elite, while ordinary people went about their daily affairs differently. But they represented a certain ideal, even a cosmological function. They became models of what human beings are basically about, their aims and aspirations, the means and stakes of human existence. The market plays the same role in capitalism. Most notes that such aristocratic views maintain their dominance in the ancient world, despite the development of commerce. But just as the latter made it possible to imagine human life in very different terms, so does the continued existence of communism and gift relations today allow us to reconfigure what human life is all about. It would take a political revolution, which was Moses' aim. As a revolutionary cooperativist, he wanted to encourage the development of new institutions based on these alternative economic practices to the point where they could displace capitalism. And that's the first part here. It's a much longer piece, but I wanted to give you this sort of overall thing that Graeber is using Marcel Mauss as a way of talking about a wider set of opportunities for kinds of exchange. Now, here's one from a socialist website, worldsocialism.org. I think actually that might be the one that Henry is fond of. But anyway, in pre-capitalist traditional societies, reciprocal transactions tended to take the form of gift exchanges. But a gift exchange is not at all the same as a market exchange. It's driven by a totally different kind of dynamic. Christopher Gregory, in his Gifts and Commodities, draws on Marx's insights to pinpoint the difference. Marx was able to develop a very important proposition that commodity exchange is an exchange of alienable things between transactors who are in a state of reciprocal independence. Now, the corollary of this is that non-commodity, that is gift exchange, is an exchange of inalienable things between transactors who are in a state of reciprocal dependence. This proposition is only implicit in Marx's analysis, but it is a precise definition of gift exchange. Hopefully I don't need to remind you that Marx was was affected and interested in, the rise as it was occurring during the time of anthropological matters. That is, the things that you would build a human science out of. In a market economy, the buyer and seller confront each other as two separate individuals having diametrically opposed interests as far as the price of the commodity being sold is concerned. They haggle over it, and once a deal has been struck and a price agreed, which will tend to fall somewhere in between what both would have respectively wanted, they go their separate ways. Rather than some natural propensity to engage in self-interested economic behavior giving rise to a market economy, it was the very growth of a market economy that gave rise to this concept of self-interested economic behavior. The absurdly unrealistic depiction of human beings as homo economicus, who only act to maximize what they individually gain from any transaction, is the cornerstone dogma of modern economic theory. It springs from an essentially individualistic worldview implied in the very concept of self-interest, which is largely bound up with the development of a market economy itself, where market transactions tend to atomize and separate individuals, i.e. alienate. Gift transactions move in a quite opposite direction. That is, to cement and solidify social relationships between people by binding them together in a whole host of open-ended and continuing rights and obligations called total prestations or prestations in the literature, of which the exchange of material goods plays a more symbolic role. Moreover, the ongoing nature of these rights and obligations is quite different from a market transaction. Who picks up the check, etc. Or, I bought you dinner. Once the buyer has bought a commodity from a seller, their relationship to the latter, in theory, ceases forthwith. This is not so in the case of a gift transaction. In his seminal essay, The Gift, written in 1925, Marcel Mauss refers to the quasi-mystical explanation for the existence of gift transactions offered by a Maori sage called Tamade Ranapiri. The spirit of the giver, called the How, suggested Ranapiri, resides in the gift itself. Although the gift may pass through many hands, it always seeks to return to its original source. An example of this was the Kula ring described by Malinowski in The Argonauts of the Western Pacific, 1922. This curious social phenomenon involved the circulation of two sets of ceremonial items, shell necklaces and armbands, each going in opposite directions around a group of far-flung island communities in the Western Pacific via the mechanism of gift exchange. We were talking before about those. This is a certain degree of abstraction, if you will. We were talking about the really human-sized coins stone coins we were talking about before. Here, too, we witness behavior driven by a belief that the spirit of the giver must return to its source. For instance, it would be considered deeply offensive to hang on to a particular item, thereby disrupting the circulation of goods, let alone to haggle over it as one might with an object of commerce. Of course, we don't need to interpret this belief that the spirit of the giver is entangled in the gift itself too literally. It is really about the entanglement of communities with each other. As such, it's better understood as a metaphor or motivating myth fostering a sense of intercommunal solidarity. Needless to say, inheritance has that sort of thing, estate, etc. Nevertheless, the inalienable character of the gifts being exchanged brings out a core difference between gift economies and capitalist market economies, where in the latter case, we find that the producers, the workers, are permanently alienated or separated from their products. The spirit of the workers is completely expunged from the product of their labor by the capitalists, who assume complete ownership of it, other than the inspected by, whatever, or in some cases, an actual signature. Another difference is that, contrary to explanations offered by the market apologists, not only did gift transactions predate market exchanges, but they also involved voluntary contractual relations, not between individuals as such, but social groups. In other words, between clans, tribes, and families, as most put it. This runs completely counter to individualistic explanations for the origins of exchange. However, according to David Graeber, the same David Graeber, over time, most argued, reciprocity can take on a more competitive cast as assertive individuals, first acting as representative clans or other social groups, later in their own capacity, end up vying to see which can outgive the other. This is illustrated by the famous potlatch ceremonies carried on amongst the Kwakiutl people on the northwest coast of North America. This was no longer strictly a gift economy, more a competition over status, which became an enshrined principle of aristocratic societies predating capitalism. Some commentators distinguish between this and the modern capitalist notions of status, in that while the latter is based on the conspicuous consumption, accumulation of wealth, the former involves the periodic giving away of wealth. If so, the difference is one of degree rather than kind. In capitalism, too, we find wealth being conspicuously given away in the guise of philanthropy. The point about competitive gift giving is that it can serve as a means to acquire prestige and hence power within a kind of patron-client setup more typical of pre-capitalist societies. Through it, the client becomes indebted and subservient to the patron. This is what facilitates the direct appropriation by a ruling class of an economic surplus from its subjects in a society like feudalism, rather than indirectly through the economic mechanism of free-waged employment under capitalism. A socialist gift economy. What of the alternative to capitalism? Socialism has sometimes been described as a kind of gift economy, where the relations between individuals are based on a system of generalized reciprocity. That is not a bad description, although one might quibble over applying the term economy in relation to socialism. As suggested, the identification of something called the economy is something peculiar to capitalism. The universalization of money-based relationships makes for a kind of vast, impersonal mechanism operating according to its own laws and behind the backs of producers, as Marx put it. Alienation, the separation of the producer from her product, seems implicit in the very conception of this thing we call the economy. Socialism might be better described as a way of life rather than an economy. According to the anthropologist Marshall Solins, there are three basic forms of reciprocal exchange. Firstly, there is balanced reciprocity, where there is expectation of an immediate return on what is being offered for exchange. This is the norm under capitalism. We can take an item off a supermarket shelf and walk off with it, but only on condition that we exchange cash for it at the cash till. Then there is negative reciprocity. Number two, as the term itself suggests, this involves the use of coercion by one party to a transaction to impose disagreeable terms or conditions on the other. The high prices charged by a monopoly, which customers have to accept, is one example of this. Another is the generalized system of wage labor intrinsic to capitalism itself. This arose partly out of the coercive disposition of the majority of their limited means of wealth production, forcing them to depend on wage labor in a process called primitive accumulation, which is still going on today in the form of land grabs in places like Africa. Finally, there is generalized reciprocity. Here, there is no expectation of an immediate return at all, nor is there even an expectation that the person making the return should be the same person to whom the gift in question was first offered. As in the case of the kula ring, the good can pass through many hands. There are many other examples of generalized reciprocity in both pre-industrial and capitalist societies. The tradition of extending hospitality to strangers in Bedouin and other pre-industrial cultures is a form of generalized reciprocity. In modern-day capitalism, the internet has often been cited as a working example of a gift economy in practice. Individuals voluntarily and without thought of payment of any kind contribute time and effort to the stupendous storehouse of information available to everyone that is the internet. As Genevieve Vaughn notes, actually, the market is limited and floating on a sea of gifts. Profit itself is a gift as it comes from the part of the labor of workers which is not covered by the salary, their so-called surplus labor. But there are also gifts of housework and of nature which are exploited by the market, which does not have to pay for the reproduction of the workers or the cleanup of pollution. As someone said in the recent movie on the internet gift economy, Us Now, the kind of capitalism we're living in has only really been so extreme during the last century. We probably should look at that. These kinds of extant non-market relations might be said to validate and further strengthen the case for a completely non-market socialist future, which in a sense, they prefigure. But they highlight is precisely what the ideology of the market seeks to conceal, that is, our mutual interdependence. Recall Gregory's thoughts on Marx's insights into the nature of commodity exchange as being an exchange of alienable things between transactors who are in a state of reciprocal independence. This idea of reciprocal independence is a logical extension of the dogma that the market economy is purely voluntary and non-coercive institution. To be independent is to be, quote unquote, free. But the idea flies in the face of reality and fails to see the wood for the trees, the larger patterns of social interconnections that bind us all. The great majority of us possessing little or no capital are economically obliged to sell our working abilities to the tiny minority who own this capital. There's nothing voluntary about this. It's a brutal, coercive, structural fact arising from the class nature of capitalism itself. Though capitalist ideology can hardly suppress the empirical fact of our practical dependence upon each other as human beings, what it does is to fall back on a second line of defense, as it were, taking this concept of practical dependency and twisting it into something else. Instead of being universally reciprocal, it is presented as something partial and one-sided. The workers are said to depend on the capitalists. The dependence of the capitalists upon the workers is thus ideologically erased by a sleight of hand, or made illusory at Christmas time. The essence of the gift relationship is the sense of moral obligation it confers upon the recipient of the gift to give something back in return. In capitalism, it's used to entrench the existing social order by inducing a contrived sense of dependency of one class upon the other. Notwithstanding a market ideology emphasizing the reciprocal independence of buyer and seller, capitalism needs to create some sense of community in which the individuals are bound together by bonds of moral obligation. Socialism, too, will need to do this, as must any kind of functioning society. However, the manner in which socialism will do so will be quite different. The very term itself, socialism, springs from the recognition of the completely socialized nature of modern production. There is literally nothing today that is produced that does not involve, directly or indirectly, the input of millions of workers right across the world. Socialism is about bringing ownership of the means of producing wealth into line with the character of modern production. The recognition that we necessarily depend on each other will translate into a generalized sense of obligation to contribute to the good of others, as well as ourselves, in a society fundamentally based on the principle of generalized reciprocity. See, we can be all nice to each other and not worry so much about these things, but, you know, there are the ideological blinkers. This is a Robin Cox article, and I wanted to close with a not necessarily because it's socialist, although it is. I just came across this because in my messing around with my reading, I was reading stuff on the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, and particularly the still imprisoned Abdullah Öcalan or Öcalan. Öcalan is also referred to as Apo, Kurdish for uncle, in popular Kurdish culture. His face and name are a symbol for the Kurdish movement, despite the fact that he's been imprisoned by Turkey since 1999 for his role in the PKK. Many argue that Abdullah Öcalan or Öcalan has actually gained power since being imprisoned at great financial cost to the Turkish government. For over a decade, he's been the sole prisoner at the infamous İmralı Island prison located in the Sea of Marmara outside of Istanbul. Öcalan communicates commands and other information through his lawyers to PKK commanders and leaders on the outside. Turkey allows this for a multitude of reasons, but many think it's because it may be better that the PKK stay as one large organization instead of being split into many, many more chaotic and unpredictable factions without Öcalan's leadership. Anyway, this is from his book on liberating life. It is a manual, as it were, for women. The PKK has treasures the role of women. It believes in, equanimity and equality. There are women fighting groups or battalions. They serve in a very important role in the continuing struggle with Turkey and the current disintegration of Syria. So I thought that this would be timely to just read his little chapter in his book on capitalism. A realistic definition of capitalism should not be presented as a constant created and characterized by unicentral thought and action. It is, in essence, the actions of opportunist individuals and groups who establish themselves into openings and cracks within society as the potential for surplus product developed. These actions became systematized as they nibbled away the social surplus. These individuals and groups never number more than 1 or 2% of society. Their strength is in their opportunism and organizational skills. Their victory relies not only on their organizational skills, but also on their control of the required objects and fluctuation of prices at the point where supply and demand intersect. If the official social forces do not suppress them, if instead these forces borrow from their profiteering, giving their continuous support in return, then these groups who exist on the margins of all societies may legitimize themselves as the new masters of society. Throughout the history of civilization, especially in Middle Eastern societies, these marginal groups of broker profiteers have always existed. But because of society's hatred of them, they could never find the courage to come into the daylight from the fissures they resided in. Not even the most despotic administrators had the courage to legitimize these groups. They were not just scorned, but seen as the most dangerous corruptive power. Their ethics were considered the root of all evil. And indeed, the unsurpassed wave of wars, plunders, massacres, and exploitation originating from Western Europe over the past 400 years is largely a result of the capitalist system's hegemony. But then the biggest counter-struggle also took place in Western Europe, hence it cannot be considered a total loss for humanity. Capitalism and the nation-state represent the dominant male in its most institutionalized form. Capitalist society is the continuation and culmination of all the old exploitative societies. It is a continuous warfare against society and women. To put it succinctly, capitalism and nation-state are the monopolism of the tyrannical and exploitative male. Breaking down this monopolism will perhaps be more difficult than breaking down the atom. A main objective of capitalist modernity's ideological hegemony is to obliterate the historic and social facts concerning its conception and its essence. This is because the capitalist economic and societal form is not a social and historical necessity. It is a construct forged through a complex process. Religion and philosophy have been transformed into nationalism, the divinity of the nation state. The ultimate goal of its ideological warfare is to ensure its monopoly on thought. Its main weapons to accomplish this are religionism, gender discrimination, and scientism as a positivist religion. Without ideological hegemony, with political and military oppression alone, maintaining modernity will be impossible. While capitalism uses religionism to control society's cognizance, it uses nationalism to control classes and citizenship, a phenomenon that has arisen around capitalism. The objective of gender discrimination is to deny women any hope of change. The most effective way for sexist ideology to function is by entrapping the male in power relations and by rendering women impotent through constant rape. Through positivist scientism, capitalism neutralizes the academic world and the youth. It convinces them they have no choice but to integrate with the system, and in return for concessions, this integration is assured. As with all oppressive and exploitative social systems, capitalism could not rise without establishing a state. Whereas the dogmatism of the feudal system had a religious character, that of the archaic slave-owning society had a mythological character. One god was embodied in the king and dynasty. But today, God is presented as the invisible power in the state's noble existence. When capitalism saw the opportunity to become a system, it started off by eliminating all societies based on the mother-woman culture. During early modernity, the strength of female sociality was still trying to maintain itself, was burnt on the stake of the witch hunter. In order to establish its hegemony over women through her profound enslavement, these burnings were very useful tools. Woman is at the service of the system today, partially because of the widespread burning of women at the onset of capitalism. The embedded fear of the stake has put women in Europe under the total servitude of the man. After eliminating women, the system mercilessly demolished the agrarian and village society. As long as the communal democratic character of society stands, capitalism cannot attain maximum power and profits. Thus, this kind of sociality was inevitably targeted. In this way, the complete entrapment of the oldest slave, that is, woman, became the model for all other enslaved lives, that of children and men. Political and military power play quite an important role in maintaining the capitalist system's hegemony, but what is crucial is to possess and subsequently to paralyze society via the cultural industry. The mentality of communities under the influence of the system is weakened and its members have become gullible. Many philosophers claim that society has been turned into a society of the spectacle, similar to the zoo. The sex, sports, arts, and culture industries in combination and in sequence bombard the emotional and analytic intelligence incessantly by means of a diverse spread of advertisements. As a result, both emotional and analytic intelligence have become completely dysfunctional. The conquering of a society's mentality is thus complete. What is of grave concern is society's voluntary acceptance of its captivity by the combined cultural and sex industries, and moreover, perceiving this as a burst of freedom. This is the strongest base and tool of legitimization that rulers have. Capitalism can only reach the empire phase with the aid of the cultural industry. Therefore, the struggle against the cultural hegemony requires the most difficult struggle of all, mental struggle, until we can develop and organize the essence and form of a counter-struggle against the cultural war waged by the system through its invasions, assimilation, and industrialization. Not a single struggle for freedom, equality, and democracy has a chance to succeed. Capitalist modernity is a system based on the denial of love, its denial of society, unrestrained individualism, gender discrimination in all areas, deification of money, substitution of God with the nation state, and turning woman into an automaton that receives little or no wages, mean that there are no material grounds for love either. Now, I find that quite interesting. PAM, it's for fairly wide distribution. It's not hardly intellectual, although everyone's got to go look up hegemony. But I just think, I suppose it is why I'm interested in the Kurds. I have no particular allegiance or alliance with Kurds. I just think that it's inevitable that they're going to be part of a continuing struggle in the Middle East. And why don't they have their own damn country since everybody else wants their own damn country? Particularly since there's so many of them that they probably deserve it. But it is, of course, the usual issue of who gets, who has the right to certain lands and et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, that's today's little a lesson about gifts, selfishness, nationalism, borders, um, to remind us that probably at some moment we should look even deeper at David Graeber's work, particularly on the 5,000 years of debt. So that's my little yammering for today. It being Christmas, I'll give you a gift of me not yammering too um, long. I could only write the pronunciation of Ossalan with phonetic signs. Um, I hope that, if you find this interesting, you'll look at, I find Ossalan just interesting because, he's just another of those Mandela type martyrs. But I think he represents a just cause, even though, of course, it threatens the Turkish state. And of course, the Turkish state today, the son of Erdogan, declared that they're going to capture Israel, which, he's not an official part of the Turkish government, but to proclaim that today is certainly interesting. I would just note as a side as a side note. Um, People have come and people have gone. Homo economicus, aka psychopaths. Yes, indeed. Let's see. I think that covers chat comments. Um, and let's see what other matters. If there are no interventions, brickbats, comments, questions, I will ask Joe to remove me from the live stream so we can go back to swearing.